All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kathleen with the National Council for History Education. Joining me tonight is my colleague Shauna. We are here to introduce you to some friends and colleagues from the Museum of the Chinese in America. And we are delighted to welcome Lauren Nashamkin and Stephanie Zank. And they will be talking with us tonight about Chinese immigration and exclusion in 19th century America. So we're delighted to bring you this webinar as part of our Epic Histories program. Hello, Epic friends, but welcome to all of you who are joining us here tonight. Please feel free to say hello in chat. Also feel free as we are going through the webinar to put any questions you might have in the Q&A box toward the bottom of your screen. And we will address questions kind of as they make sense throughout the workshop. So now I will turn it over to Lauren to get us started. Welcome,
Great.
Lauren.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, but you'll see Stephanie will rotate throughout, so you'll get to meet her if you haven't seen her in the little boxes. I'm going to share a little bit about MoCA, but I'm really excited to be here with you from folks from all over. Um, if you ever have to email us and you have burning questions after this, you can email us both at education@moca.nyc. I'm going to share a tiny bit about our history and then we're going to dive in since there's not that much time. Actually, with webinars, I'm not sure if there are reactions, but maybe you can throw in the chat if you've ever been to the Museum of Chinese America, MoCA for short, or if you've ever been to Chinatown, and that can be New York City Chinatown or any Chinatown in your home state. Um, so we were founded as a repository of Chinatown history by two men, Jack Chen and Charlie Lai. They were really interested in the changing neighborhood, and they thought there was no real home for Chinese American stories and stuff. So they kind of started collecting stories, oral histories from elders, and dumpster diving and learning more about businesses that were closing. And all of that turned into our lovely museum. So first it was a project, then it turned into a history museum about New York City Chinatown. Then we realized that scope was actually way too small, and this is really a Chinese American story. So that, yeah, long story short, many years later, we turned into the Museum of Chinese in America, which we are today. And this is our core exhibit with a single step stories in the making of America. And that's, if you come visit, that's on my screen behind my background and also what you'll see in person. This is going to play briefly, but I'm going to skip it. We do have a great introduction to the museum on our website. It's also really good for students. It's an 18-minute tour. We're going to press by that. And then we also have some curricular resources, which we'll share later with a link, including our MoCA Heroes student magazines. But we're going to dive right in. So today we're going to think about a lot of instances of rising xenophobia, anti-Chinese sentiment, kind of legislation, but also popular opinion during the period of westward expansion. But before we start, I just wanted to do a little exercise. So you can do this. We're going to do part of this mind map exercise, but we'll share the longer version just to save some time. And so pick one of the following words, and you can either use like your notes app on your phone, or you can use a piece of paper. So pick one word or phrase, and then we're going to spend 60 whole seconds in a moment kind of just thinking of any words, writing down any words or associations that come to mind. I'm going to give you 5 more seconds to pick your word or phrase. And then I'm going to start a timer on my phone. Let's do 1 minute. All right. So you're going to have 1 minute and write down anything that comes to mind with your phrase. And after your minute is over, I'm going to have people, maybe we're going to go word by word and you can enter into the chat some of the words or phrases that kind of came up for you. Got 20 more seconds. All right, a fast minute. So maybe folks in the chat can kind of share, anyone who put in Gold Rush, maybe you can put some of the words that came to mind. Um, into the chat. Um, maybe we can do, well, maybe we can do all of the words. So just, you can just populate the chat with kind of like the most prominent words or phrases that kind of came up when you thought of these things. Sutter's Mill. Okay, so that must be for Gold Rush. 49ers, American exceptionalism, Gold Mountain, exploitation. Okay, Transcontinental Railroad, native dispossession. All right, so here we clearly have some folks who are history buffs. California, mud, river, Native Americans, westward expansion, cowboy culture. Awesome. Okay, so feel free to keep these coming. I'm gonna go to, so typically the next step in our mind map. So usually what we do is we start with this, but then we use that list and we create kind of a web afterwards to think about how are we going to organize these things in a visual way using color, using like the kind of font, using size, and just like arrows, just a way to have a visual way to put together make some connections maybe that we didn't see before. This is kind of an example that is just about a mind map. And we found this to be really successful, especially with students in thinking, what are their like preconceived notions of something? What's their prior knowledge? And just like what connections are they making or that can we draw out a little bit later? So we'll share like the full version of this activity. Maybe it's something you're very familiar with, but it does get us thinking to a little bit more about our themes and objectives for the day. So we're not going to get, we're going to touch on all of these just a little bit, but we're hoping to build a more critical picture of the construction of the American West, people who lived there, people who emigrated. Some of people's words touched on that, like the different people who were, who pioneers engaged with. We're also going to draw connections between popular opinions of generally white Americans towards Chinese and Chinese American workers and the laws that that came about after. And we're going to consider kind of some responses from Chinese Americans to this rising xenophobia and violence. And some of the questions we'll consider are on this screen and some that you probably consider in your classrooms today. How do we define progress today and how did Americans define progress in that time? And how is Manifest Destiny still rooted in our understanding and teaching of history? So we're going to take a quick look at this image. And maybe you can share in the chat if you've seen it before. It is certainly one of the more prominent images, especially when thinking about westward expansion studies. So this is called American Progress. It's a oil painting by John Gast, and it was commissioned in 1872 as part of like a travel guide for the American West. So I want to ask a couple questions and maybe we can all respond in the chat. But what does progress look like in this photo? How is it visually defined? And what types of technology do you see different people using? Okay, we have white people moving in, machines. Yeah, what kind of machines do we see? Yes. Okay, someone already pointed this out and it was going to be another question. Progress is light color and like actually like it is illuminated in this image. Railroads, yes, that's the kind of technology we see. The East is more developed than the West, but it's kind of you can see it's going that direction. Does anyone know what Columbia, who's the woman in the center, is holding? It's a little hard to see. Yes, a telegraph wire and a history book. Yes, so there's this this image really well encapsulates this idea of like, forging west by this almost kind of like God-given right, right? This illumination and who is being driven out here. Yes, progress centered on interests of white settlers. Um, I'm going to zoom in on one part of the image. Yeah, so who do we see here and who's yeah, Native Americans being forced out. Yes, we see animals and natives, indigenous people, animals, and what kind of technology do the indigenous people have? Um, yeah, so they're being pushed off their land and they have their bows and arrows, right? And you have this like westward farming and cultivation materials and wagons and other things and guns, right? So kind of this new industry and technology displacing native populations. Um, so we're going to kind of push back a little bit on this kind of notion of, or kind of consider all the different people in this and the people who aren't in here. So we have the Transcontinental Railroad, but we don't have the people who really built it. So I'm going to pass over to Stephanie, who's going to chat a little bit about what it looks like to be Chinese American at this moment in time and what the United States looks like.
Yeah, so we just have this slide up also to think about. Many of these places that we're talking about in the West are places that have been territories and are now becoming states. As territories, sometimes there's a little bit of a sense that they're not quite under the law, they're a little bit looser about that. And then that also is going to impact ideas of who belongs, especially legally, where territories may be operating a little differently than something that's officially a state. Now, something that's very important to note as well, we were talking a little bit about the railroads, about building infrastructure and progress. Much of this was from the West Coast being built by Chinese immigrants. So people were coming for the Transcontinental Railroad being specifically brought in. And then there were also people coming as miners, doing farming work, building up vineyards in California and Oregon, as well as other industries. So there is a Chinese population starting to grow on the west coast of the US. So if we can have the next slide. The next slide shows us an etching of the Chinese Embassy of 1868. So this brought us what's called the Burlingame Treaty. And this treaty did a couple of different things in terms of thinking about Chinese people who are migrating or coming to the US. Their rights are protected by this treaty. They are authorized to be here. Their workers' rights are protected. People from China are allowed to migrate based on the results of this treaty. There's also a big trade component to this treaty. So China is granted most favored nation status. So this is enshrining US-China friendship and free immigration, trade status, everything is good to go. So on the next slide, um, we have the population of Chinese people, of Chinese immigrants in the United States. So what are you noticing about this, especially by decades? Anything sticking out to anybody about the Chinese population here? You can go ahead and put that in the chat, but it always takes a minute to parse a table like this, so take a minute. So people are noticing the numbers are going up and then down. We'll talk more about why the down happened. That's a pretty significant chunk of history. Anything you notice about the total Chinese population in comparison to just the general US population? Okay, yeah, so the total US population is increasing really high. For the Chinese population, it's still a very, very small percentage of the overall US population. There is not a huge number of people who are Chinese. And yeah, the Chinese population has an up and then a down, despite the US population is simply going up. So if we can have the next slide, that's going to show us a little bit more specific data about California. Now, I should point out here, 1890 is blank. There was a fire in the 1920s in the National Archives, so the census records are kind of spotty then. So if the first thing you notice is there's a blank decade, that's why. What else do you notice beyond the blank decade? Anything striking anyone? There's a big surge. So 1850, tiny numbers of people in California. 1860s, 1870s, suddenly a huge increase, way, way up in 1880s. And then same as we saw nationwide, it starts to go down again. Again, hold on to that thought. We will talk about why. There's a very good reason. But as we're looking at these numbers, though, what you can see is there is a really big increase in about the 1860s and continuing into the 80s, 90s, depends on records that are no longer with us. So we're going to start to see some impact of this growth of population to the broader US population. And Lauren is going to share a little bit more with us about one example of this in popular culture, where there was an initial reaction to the presence of people from China.
Yeah, so while we see that percentage is really small of Chinese immigrants to California and in general, we do see that there is a sudden surge. Obviously, that comes with the gold rush, and a lot of other immigrants came in search of gold as well. And we're going to kind of look at one source and then think about the impact of how do people perceive the new recent Chinese immigrant population? So what we're looking at right now is an 1870 narrative poem by Bret Harte. It was originally published in the Overland Monthly, and it was called Plain Language from Truthful James, but it then became known as the Heathen Chinese. And so Harte was actually sympathetic towards the plight of a lot of Chinese immigrants, kind of the hypocrisy of how they were treated, often by people who were just immigrants the last decade themselves, people who came from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and also experienced hostility, but then were very quick to turn on the newest immigrants. So this was originally a satire and a critique of this anti-Chinese sentiment that a lot of white Americans held. And while it was not his intention, this poem actually brought the term heathen into popular usage when referring to Chinese and Chinese Americans, which we'll see kind of throughout this session. So he didn't invent a lot of the stereotypes that he ends up satirizing, but this poem did reach a really wide audience, and it was not received in the way that he expected. People actually took it for like at face value, and it was circulated widely and really perpetuated a lot of like anti-Chinese thoughts. And it eventually became really divorced from its original context. It was set to sheet music, which you can see here. And there were images drawn up about it, and it even turned into a song, even went across the Atlantic, and it was performed in London and other places. The poem tells the story of a card game played by an Irishman named William Nye and a Chinese man named Ah Sin, and you can read into the names, and a narrator. So we're going to listen to a version of this song that was very perplexingly re-recorded in 1988 in like a series and album about the West. And while it plays, I'm going to share a kind of a booklet with the stanzas, and you can kind of see related imagery. So I want you to definitely take a look at that. But before it plays, I just want to take a look at these three questions to keep in mind, and I'll flash these again later. But how are the Irish and Chinese men portrayed in this poem? What stereotypical traits do each of them have? You can search for language and imagery that support this. And then eventually later, we'll think about the lasting impacts of this. A couple vocab terms. They're playing a card game called euchre, and a bower is like an ace or a high level card. So I'm gonna have to stop sharing for a second to get to our music. Oops. Nope. And we're gonna share. So this is gonna be about 3 minutes long, a little less.
And my language
Stephanie, did you hear that when I played it for a second? Okay, great.
is plain, that for ways that are dark and for tricks that are vain, the heathen Chinese is peculiar, which the same I would rise to explain. Ah, Sin was his name, and I shall not deny in regards to the same what that name might imply. But his smile, it was pensive and childlike, as I frequent remarked to Bill Nye. It was August the 3rd, and quite soft was the skies, which it might be inferred that Ah Sin was likewise. But he played it that day upon William, and me in the way I despise, which we had a small game. Ah Sin took a hand. It was euchre, the same he did not understand, but he smiled as he sat by the table, with a smile that was childlike and bland. Yet the cards they were stocked in a way which I grieve, and my feelings were shocked at the state of Nye's sleeve, which was stuffed full of aces and bowers, and the same with intent to deceive. But the cards that were played by that heathen Chinese, and the points that he made were quite frightful to see, till at last he lay down a right bower, which the same Nye had dealt unto me. I looked up at Nye, and he gazed upon me, and he rose with a sigh, and he said, "Can this be? We are ruined by Chinese cheap labor." And he went for that heathen Chinese. In the scene which ensued, I did not take a hand, and the floor it was strewn like the leaves on the strand, with the cards that Ah Sin had been hiding in a game he did not understand. In his sleeves, which were long, we found 24 jacks, which is going it strong, yet I state but the facts. And we found on his nails, which were tapered, what is common to tapers, that's wax. Which is why I remark in my language that's plain, that for ways that are dark and for tricks that are vain, the heathen Chinese is peculiar, which the same I am free to maintain.
All right, thanks for listening to the whole song. Obviously, you could see that something happened there where it's a narrative story. So maybe we can pop in the chat now. How are the Irishman and the Chinese man portrayed? Oh, Michigan peeps all know euchre. I did not know euchre, but good to know that. Yeah, cheaters. Okay. Can we talk more about cheaters? Who's cheating? Who's cheating first? Who's cheating second? Who is the ultimate cheater of all the cheaters? And then we'll go back to some of the images. Okay. Let's see. Let's go back. Whoops. So at first, yeah, so the Chinese character at first seems really innocent. It says he didn't understand, and he smiled and he sat, but then you could tell that he had a game plan. Yeah, so both of them are cheaters, but Ah Sin cheated worse or better, as some would say, than inciting kind of anger from the Irish person. Yes, the Irish character knew that he dealt the card to himself. Yeah, so we have this idea that it's okay, maybe it's okay if I cheat, but when you, the newcomer, cheats, Not so sure. And what about the physical traits that we see here? So you can see both the Irishman and the Chinese man. What do you notice about how they look? What are the things that stand out to you most about their physical characteristics? So here we have a close-up on the Irishman. You can see a lot of the typical kind of raggedy clothes. Yeah, that seems to hit on all of the stereotypes, right? Weird nose, for sure. Irishman looks dirty, maybe poor. Definitely a lot of this imagery coming from a lot of the folks who came over from the potato famine. Yeah, they definitely, the Chinese man is noted as being peculiar. You can see his hair, his queue, which is a common hairstyle for the time, kind of like exoticized. Certainly the long fingernails are pointed out in the card game. And the Irishman seems a little bit more masculine. Yeah, so these are we're gonna keep seeing this kind of imagery. So pay attention to how this compares to others. And I would say just to contemplate for yourself, we don't have to share this in the chat, but think about the immediate and lasting impacts of perpetuating stereotypes like this for both Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants. And also the fact that this was meant to be a joke and then taken for truth. So we have to think about what else is happening at that time, and Stephanie is gonna share a little bit more about that.
Yes, and I can go ahead and also share my screen now if you want.
Sure. Mhm.
Okay. So I will. You might have to close your screen off and I'll do that. But yeah, so what we're seeing, we're definitely seeing that there is, you know, there's like sort of pop culture things going on that are going to be showing us anti-Chinese sentiment. This is not just showing up in pop culture, this is not just showing up in political cartoons and things like that. We're also seeing race-based taxes in legislation. So we're starting to see where the state is now taking on, states and localities are now taking on these kinds of ways of showing discrimination and bias. So a big one and a very early one is the Foreign Miners Tax Act of 1850 in California. So on paper, it requires all non-citizens who want to mine in California to pay $20 a month. Who is it really being enforced on? People who are identifiable, Chinese and Latino miners. I'm always kind of amused by this one, the sidewalk ordinance. So that's in San Francisco. You can't carry your goods around on a pole on the sidewalk. This is historically very, very common in China. So even if they're not saying it's about people who are Chinese, they're targeting someone. They're interested in targeting specifically people who are of Chinese heritage. Same kind of thing with the cubic air ordinance. They're saying in the city, oh, this is a health regulation. You have to have at least this much space for a resident. Well, the only people who are really getting fined or arrested for this are people who are Chinese. Everyone else are like, So this is always kind of something to watch out for when we're looking at state legislations and local legislations. Not only what does it say on paper, who is it getting targeted to? Same kinds of things. We have, and you can kind of see it where with Lauren's backdrop, there's a full wall of these in a couple places in the museum, literally like 10 feet up down to the floor. You cannot see all of them. People come in and go, what? So this is just to show how many of these kinds of areas of legislation there are. So there's political cartoons, there's songs, there's jokes, there's these smaller scale laws that are being done by cities and by states. There is also outbreaks of racially motivated violence in a number of places. So this image, Pacific Chivalry, this is a cartoon that's going out. There's many things going on here, but it is showing you violence against Chinese immigrants, and that is happening in real life. So one major area, one major early one is the Chinese Massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles. There's a Denver riot. There's a massacre of miners in Rock Springs. Tacoma, multiple places. We'll talk a little bit right now about these first two, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Tacoma after we go ahead with some of the history here. So has anyone heard of this Los Angeles massacre of 1871? If you have, you can go ahead and put that in the chat. Okay, some folks have. Fantastic. I'll try to do a brief overview of this. This is just a view of the Chinatown neighborhood in the 1880s, so a little bit later in Los Angeles. But what happened, there was lots of context behind it, but two sort of rival organizations got into a shootout. Police responded along with some white male civilians, and several people were shot, including one of these white men who was killed. And as retaliation for this, a mob of about 500 people stormed the Chinatown in October of 1871, and what ended up happening was at least 18 people were killed. At least 18 Chinese residents were killed, including one who was a teenager. 10 of these white men who participated in this mob violence were convicted and charged with manslaughter, but these convictions were overturned, and this made national news. We actually found this from the New York Herald about 6 days after the massacre, pointing out that also really pointing out they suffer anything worse than arrest. We found the wording here really interesting. It's very very pointed in a lot of ways. I don't know if anyone can see towards the end, there's possibly a solution as well to this issue with convictions being overturned. Voting rights. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. So this is a huge mass lynching of people of Chinese heritage, who most of whom weren't involved in the original situation. We do have as well in Denver, there was an anti-Chinese riot. This happened a little bit later in 1880, also in October. Bad luck month. What do you see happen on here? You can go ahead and put any observations in the chat. I'll zoom in a tiny bit in a moment. What seems to be happening? So folks are noticing there's mob violence. There seem to be onlookers maybe cheering or encouraging. Yeah, there's people who seem like they might be officers and white men who are beating Chinese men here. I will zoom in a little bit. We're throwing things out of windows, so causing a huge amount of property damage in Chinese stores. There's looting, and if we zoom into the bottom of it, so again, a lot of violence. So this ended up that this is another one, there was a little bit of a scuffle in a saloon and turned into a full-on brawl. Something like 3,000 people ended up just terrorizing the entire Chinatown, destroying things, throwing stuff out of windows, as we're noticing, and generally wreaking havoc. And yeah, noticing the Chinese seem, at least in this seem to be victims. They're unarmed. They're mostly passing away. Did end up losing his life in this case. And did a huge amount of property damage, something like 53.5 million today. So we are seeing all of this physical violence, and there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in political cartoons and in advertisement. Major piece of legislation some folks have run into, but let's pause to look at this. Sorry, my second screen is over here, which is why I'm pointing at it like you can see me. But this is a political cartoon of showing Chinese, anti-Chinese sentiment. So what are some things we're noticing here? We've got this guy on the left, and then these people on the right. And the question is, what shall we do with our boys? What looks like it might be the problem here? What's being said about Chinese immigrants? And let's think specifically about ideas around jobs and employment. Aha, yep. Chinese immigrants are taking jobs. Just some jobs? A few jobs? One job? All the jobs. This guy is doing everything. And who is out of a job? The white men are not getting jobs. So this is going to lead us to a piece of legislation that is really, really important to talk about. I will just super quickly skip here too, because these people are a big part of this legislation. The Working Men's Party of California, they have declared Chinatown a nuisance for health reasons, which is very commonly done when we're anti-immigration. But let's talk a little bit more about a piece of legislation that the Working Men's Party of California was very pro. And Lauren, I can keep sharing the screen, but you can go ahead and walk us through this.
Sounds good. Yeah, echoing some of the other comments in the chat, you can change the clothing and use the same concept in modern cartoon. And very, very triggering and sobering. A lot of these images are. So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, has everyone heard of this? You can feel free to let us know in the chat. Now I think, okay, most people have. So if you know anything about it, even a little bit, you can feel free to add anything you know in the chat. And we're going to ask one different question. We're going to flash it on the screen. Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, immigrants from China could not, and you can put the letter in A, become citizens, B, leave the US and come back, C, bring their families to the US, D, testify in court, E, vote, and F, all of the above. And you can write your answer in the chat or add any comments you like. The article that Stephanie posted before hinted at one of these. All right. This was a ringer, clearly. Everyone's getting F, right? So typically when we think of the Chinese Exclusion Act, we only think of the idea that Chinese immigrants could no longer come to the US, but sometimes less so. We don't think about these things like testifying in court and voting. We can go to the next slide and probably the next one after that, I think. So another thing that's often kind of overlooked when we think about the Chinese Exclusion Act is that the initial act of 1882 was passed in May, and it was only temporary. It was an experiment for just 10 years. Then, as we saw, a lot of that violence was still happening. They're thinking about enforcing it. They're thinking about how is this test going to work out. This is the first piece of race-based legislation that's on a federal level in the entire United States. So simply because you are Chinese, you cannot enter the US. It is hierarchical. It does say if you are a student, if you're a diplomat, if you are a businessman or merchant, you can come in, but otherwise you are forbidden from coming in. So it's tiered racially and economically. And you know what? Seems like Americans like this experiment. So first, they said, actually, this applies to you if you're coming from somewhere else, but you are Chinese. So if you lived in Peru for 10 years, if you were somewhere else, it doesn't matter your country of origin, it's China, so it applies to you as well. And then you could, if you were here, you could not go back and come back. So you couldn't go back to China and come back to the US after. Before, you were able to get a special certificate that said you were here before and you should be able to come back. Some people were stranded in China when this rule changed. And then we have 10 years later, the Geary Act. 10 years into this experiment, people realize, how are we going to enforce this? Actually, we're going to require everyone to carry an ID. So you have to get a certificate of identification and identity, and that has to have a photo on it that you have to produce yourself. And this was highly protested by the Chinese 6 companies and individual Chinese immigrants, which we'll come to learn later. And you know what? After those 10 years, it was made permanent in 1902. So often we learn about the act, but we don't learn about the longevity of it and the different chances that we had as an American public to kind of go back and change things. And it's really until 1943, which is an incredibly long time, that this act persists. So another thing that we think about, so we can go to the next slide, is, so Stephanie pointed out a lot of the instances of racial violence before, and this was before exclusion, kind of leading up to it in the territories. But we also have some after, right? We're thinking about exclusion really impacts the formation of communities, but it was not immediately clear once it was passed to a lot of the proponents of exclusion how it would be enforced, and to what extent. So a lot of this violence persisted. People specifically in the West Coast saw a lot of Chinese in their communities still. And there's one instance that happens in Tacoma. So you can read this short article. Take a moment and maybe you can note anything in the chat that you think comes up here. So I'll read it a little bit. So Governor of Washington Territory sent a special report to the Secretary of the Interior about anti-Chinese agitation on the subject of forcing Chinese residents to leave, particularly on counties bordering the Puget Sound. Several public meetings have been held, of which there were present delegates of the Knights of Labor, so not the Working Men's Party, but a very similar kind of union, and violent incendiary speeches were made. And it says there's not been an outbreak yet, but trouble has been threatened. So if we go to the next slide, what we'll see is that not only is trouble threatened, but trouble comes on November 3rd. So a lot of mass meetings in Tacoma, Washington, and a lot of threats about driving the Chinese out physically. And on November 3rd, this comes to pass. That was the deadline, and 500 citizens marched through Chinatown, going to all of the different businesses and instructed everyone to leave or be forced out. And those who did not leave several days later were their businesses were burned and they were physically forced out, whether it be on wagons or marched to the literal train station to go to Portland, Oregon. So the next slide, yes, it should be 1885, sorry. I don't know why that says 1985. Then this slide is a very strange picture because it shows Tacoma's 27, and these are the 27 people who incited this violence. A lot of them are public officials, including the mayor of that town. So the fact that there is a photo is showing that these are kind of like a heroic people. So they, as you can imagine, they were put on trial but never convicted, as was very popular for the time. And the mayor was one of the people inciting this violence. And this was called, later, this was called the Tacoma method. So it was a way that people from this city said that this is a way you could successfully drive out Chinese populations and get rid of Chinatowns in your area. So it was literally like this method of expelling people. And this happened all over the Pacific Northwest. It happened in Oregon, it happened in Wyoming, and a lot of other places. Yeah, and there is a baby. There's a baby in this photo. So we're thinking about what are the kinds of violence that we're perpetuating and how are we elevating that to kind of a national stage. Definitely think we should consider the role of women as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie, and she's going to talk more about what recourse did Chinese Americans have, right? So we heard here perpetrators were not brought to justice, but what voices, what did they share, and what could they do in the face of all this discrimination?
Yeah, because this isn't something that people are just going, oh, well, what am I going to do? There's multiple voices from multiple sides that are saying, hang on a second, there's problems with this law, there's problems going on here. One thing that we often will walk students through to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, some of you may have run into this cartoon before, actually. It's pretty popular to analyze this, is called The Only One Barred Out. So take like 30 seconds. I'll give a tiny bit of context for it, where the sign's talking about communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, and hoodlums. Specifically, the socialists, nihilists, and Fenians at this point are also actually associated with acts of public violence. The Fenians are advocating for an independent Irish Republic through armed rebellion. So we're talking about genuine aggressive acts. How about this Chinese guy who's sitting outside? What things are associated with him? You can put that in the chat. Ooh, hey, he's got industry, order, peace, and sobriety. And yet he's shut out of these golden gates, even though all these other people are welcome. So this is this is part of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which had a huge circulation at the time that this was published in 1882. So this is a very mainstream publication saying, hey, hang on a second, why are these people coming in and this guy who just wants to have a job is shut out? What's going on here? So that's one voice that's pointing this out. We have other examples of similar things. In terms of individual voices, one really famous one is this guy, Wang Qinfu. Has anyone run into his name before? We have a whole 1-hour program on him because he's so interesting. Okay, so at least one or two folks have. So Wang Qinfu was really in the US in our collections is like this newspaper that he was in the 1870s. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And so when training came up, and specifically this is his response to the gear and to that requirement that every
Okay, I think maybe there was some tech issues, so I'm gonna pick up the share. Let me just zoom forward in time.
Sorry about that. I got kicked off. My internet hates me. This is why we always have 2 people on these programs.
All right, we're back. So Wang Qinfu's response to the Geary Act is on the screen now, and you can read it. Just one of the words is no longer on popular usage, so I'm not going to read that one. But is it then a crime to be Chinese? Shall I be dragged from my bed at midnight because I shall refuse to be photographed? No, I will not be photographed against my will like a criminal. I would be hanged first. So this is in response to, remember I talked about this idea that you had to be photographed for your certificate of identity. And that came with a deadline. By a certain time, you had to register and you had to be photographed. And in his newspaper and also in the Equal Rights League that he created, he was an active voice against this. He was the first person to testify before Congress. We don't know what he said, but certainly spoke against the Geary Act. We're going to skip this quickly. And then we're going to talk about what happens when this comes to a head. So people being forced to register by a certain date and not wanting to do that. Stephanie, I don't know if you're good now or if you prefer I keep going.
I think I'm good. We'll find out. Do you want to just keep the screen share up since you've
I'll
got
keep
it
it.
now? Sounds great. So this boycott here is really interesting, actually. And if you have not heard of this guy, the academic Mark T. Johnson did a great book on Chinese immigrants in Montana, where a lot of this was enforced. Um, Part of the Geary Act, as we've been talking about, is this idea of being photographed. And then in 1905, the US government started this special census to make sure that all of these people who are of Chinese heritage, who are supposed to be carrying around ID, actually have it. And they're being very restrictive, very aggressive towards people who are coming from China to the US, even people who are technically allowed in. So there is, as you maybe can see a little bit, this huge boycott in China of US goods, and specifically flour being boycotted, which is going to be having a huge impact on people in the US. And it points out, no sales have been made since July. This is published in August. Orders are being canceled. Really, really big problem with US-China trade. If we go to the next slide, then there's also a lot of awareness of this among Chinese communities. So this is being publicized in China. This is also being publicized in the US. Anyone notice what animal is being shown here? I don't expect anyone to be able to read the Chinese characters, although if you can, certainly feel free. It's a turtle. So some of what's being said here is, if you keep by, oh, hey, there we go. We've got a book recommendation. Yes, absolutely. So what this is saying is, if you are not supporting this boycott of US goods, you are a low animal living in the mud, cold-blooded. You're not even really worth considering as a person. So this was in a Montana newspaper that out of 1,000 people in the town had 40 Chinese residents. So this is really well known. And then there's this excerpt from a really great article in The Atlantic, and this is actually coming from a white male author, pointing out that this boycott, there's a lot of reason behind this boycott. If you want to take a minute to look at this, some key points, that this is not coming from the government, this is coming from popular influence. And that, really this isn't terribly surprising if people are being treated this way, that we're going to be seeing boycotts in similar situations. So if this interests you, Mark Johnson has a really good book called The Middle Kingdom Under the Big Sky. He goes into a lot of detail, and he did intense research about how some of this dissent was showing up. The boycott does end. If we go to the next slide, I'm looking at my clock, so I do need to keep us moving. The boycott does end in 1906, in large part because of President Theodore Roosevelt's actions. He issues an executive order that's requiring the Immigration Bureau to uphold rights of Chinese who are exempt. He has people who are really aggressive enforcement officers moved to other jobs or other positions where they're not dealing with Chinese. And he's supporting a scholarship program to bring Chinese students to the US to study. We did mention already, exclusion does also eventually end in the 1940s during the Second World War. And that's sort of where we wanted to leave us for some room for questions. We only have about 5 minutes, but you probably have a lot of things you would like to ask. We do definitely want to recommend that if you're interested in this, you read the two books. You read Mark Johnson's book, and then I was also about to recommend Beth Lou Williams's book on a similar topic, which I'm going to mute myself and go find the titles for so that I can give both of those to you in the chat, and we'll also send those later.
Definitely, if any questions came up, this is your time to ask them. I think there was a question earlier about the only man barred out, saying, is he trying to assimilate? And I think it can be read a couple of ways. I'm gonna try to go to that slide. But one of the things that's most notable there, oops, I don't know which one it is that he looks more human. And it's one of the few images where you see someone who's Chinese just looking a little bit more human. So that's like one of the differences. And yeah, you do see the Western hat and the clothes are less overdrawn. But I do think you still see shoes and you still see the queue. You see elements that are more Chinese, but you don't, they're just drawn in a more humanizing way. But I think that's the only question that we didn't address, but maybe feel free to pop others in the chat. Yeah, like he's trying to, sure, like he's trying to figure out his identity for sure. And honestly, a more honest representation, likely. We're also going to share, we have a lesson plan about the Chinese in the West that has to do with some other sheet music, not the Heathen Chinese, but and we'll share that in a Google Drive as well as kind of a list of a lot of these. We have a couple resource sheets about like the instances of racial violence, and you can kind of map those with kind of legislation at the time. So it's a really interesting comparison. Yeah, we can definitely share the slides as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions.
Definitely. And our galleries are often really full of depiction, like so many different kinds of depictions. So the What Shall We Do with Our Boys, we have a different a different version of that with a Chinese man has monopoly all over his hand, and he's got all these industries underneath. So there's a lot related to kind of jobs and taking them, and that's actually why it's so striking that when you see kind of a positive image, it is so striking because you're like, whoa, I haven't seen that. And it's also, I mean, the fact that there was this song, which I will share, yes, the link to, it that was a satire and then it was completely taken for truth and that this working men's party completely ran with it. And the slogan, "The Chinese Must Go," was adopted. One of the things we'll share in the lesson plan is a song literally called "The Chinese Must Go." So they're like really trying to hit you over the head with this kind of messaging. And it was really common at the time. It wasn't, you didn't have to shirk away from having these feelings in public, right? Yes, well, also the book titles. We will maybe if you can save this chat, and send it to us, we'll make sure we address all the things in the chat. And we're really excited that hopefully some of you will be coming to New York and seeing our space and the vibrant Chinatown that we're in. So we look forward to that.
I did see a question about addressing this with fifth graders. I recommend doing some individual stories. There's a lot of great stuff on the Angel Island Immigrant Foundation about people who came in as paper sons trying to kind of get around the Exclusion Act. And that's often a very accessible way because there's a lot of teenagers. So if you're considering fifth graders, definitely thinking about individuals and stories. And there's a great book on Tyrus Wong, who is an artist, and he also came in as a paper son. So that can be a really great opener. We get a lot of groups reading that.
I think also we have a Mocha Heroes magazine on Chinese railroad workers, and one thing we find is that that's often like a blip. There's gold rush, and then Chinese came to work on the railroads, and because we don't have any of the names of any of the railroad workers, that it's really hard to attach like that much meaning to it and connection. But there is actually a lot that we know about it, and they also participated in a strike. And there's, yeah, so I would recommend that. It's written for like a 4th to 6th grade level. And it's a really good entry point to thinking about what was it like to be Chinese in America as a railroad worker, and what did railroad workers do after, and how were they perceived, and how were they paid in comparison to others. A lot of this kind of the maybe, and the imagery is a little bit lighter and easier to approach versus some of the political cartoons that can be kind of a little violent and extreme.
All right, well, we are out of time, so I will officially end the program. But Lauren and Stephanie, I hope if there are any last minute questions, you wouldn't mind hanging out for a moment. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Lauren and Stephanie for the amazing presentation. And we hope to see you all again. Our next webinar will be on March 12th at 7:30 Eastern, and we'll be looking for or looking at historical markers and connections between history and place. So we hope to see you again, if not at that webinar, at another future NCHE event. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night.